Hello, and welcome back to another year of my Halloween special. If you've been following me for a while, you know this is something I do every year, and because I love Halloween, I love watching scary movies. If you're new to this, well then basically what I do is I talk about scary movies. Sometimes it's reviews, sometimes it's little skits involved for 31 days for the month of October, from the 1st to the 31st. I love to talk about the Halloween monsters, I love to talk about the horror movies. I just love that kind of stuff, and Halloween's always been my favorite holiday of the year. So that's right, 31 episodes in 31 days. Now this is quite taxing, to be honest. There's a lot of work to do, especially if I'm using any kind of effects, or I'm trying to make a whole storyline arc. This year I've been really busy, so I haven't really been able to develop a full storyline arc to go with this year's special. So if you're expecting something like last year or the year before, where there's a recurring character once in a while with a whole story, I'm sorry to say there isn't this year. There probably won't be many effects as well, because most of my equipment is at my other house. I moved house and all my equipment is still over there. So I don't have the necessary components to do everything this year. But I'm going to try and make do with what I have. I'll try and throw some things in if I can. My original idea was to do all practical effects. And there's a reason for it. Are you ready? Because of this year's theme. It is, drumroll please, the 80s. That's right. So all this month I'm going to be talking about 80s horror movies. Now, people's asked me before, what is my favorite era for horror movies? And it's a really hard one to make, because all eras have some really good horror movies and some aren't as good, but all eras will have some good and some bad. For me, I would see horror movies in 4 stages of evolution. The early black and white, going from like the silent movies to kind of the universal monster period. That's what I call the classic golden age, and I absolutely love that period. The next one we come to is kind of the 60s into the early 70s. That's when we start seeing more blood, more gore, slashers and things like that. And my third period is the 80s, which I'm going to talk about a lot more later, so I won't get into that. And the fourth period is the 2000s, where things tried being like more real. There's kind of a lot more jump scares and stuff like that. To be honest with you, there are some very good horror movies made in that time period, but it's probably my least favorite. That and maybe the mid 60s. The early 70s had some really good ones, and the early 60s, the sci-fi one, I guess you could call that period, was really cool, where we had a lot of like space aliens, monsters. But this year I'm going to be talking all about the 80s. I mean, hey, I'm an 80s kid, right? And I just grew up with these 80s horror movies. I just remember watching them when I was younger. Sometimes being scared, sometimes getting good laugh out of it. But even though some of the movies were really bad, they were done in that kind of bad way that they were actually good. So yeah, man oh man, there were some great horror movies made in the 80s. And like I said, we saw a bunch of like, this was the rise of independent filmmaking in horror movies, I believe. It did start a little bit earlier than that in the 70s, when you had things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Friday the 13th. But the 80s took it to a whole new level. And it really was like a boom for the future generation. I mean, a lot of great actors and directors now were involved in those independent movies. You had, companies like Troma coming out, and now more than ever, people could start to make what they envisioned. We also saw this big technology boost that really helped with the effects in movies as well. And I'm going to go back to that, the word effects. So my original idea, something that I really wanted to do, was do all the effects in terms of practical effects, try and not use the computer at all apart from just editing. Unfortunately, with time and the materials I had, and it being only me, I could not do that. Now, this does not mean to say that I might not do that in a future episode, because I really do like the idea of practical effects. It just was not practical for me to be able to do it in time. And I'm recording this in September, and really I like to get these things started in August. But like I said, I was really, really busy and I didn't have time for that. I want to take a moment and talk about some of the 80s stuff just as a general, because we saw some of the titans coming from the 80s. We had the remake of The Thing, and then of course we had Jason, we had Freddy Krueger, we had Pinhead. Like, we had the juggernauts of horror movies. This is when we start to see franchises coming out, not just one or two movies, like full franchises. So for me, that really made the 80s as a golden era for me. I normally say in horror movies, there's two golden eras. The 20s to 30s, and then the 80s as well. I'm not taking anything away from other decades. There were some really great movies, but I feel that these two golden eras of horror movies really set the standards and like forced the future for horror as a genre. The 80s saw a lot of really weird stuff coming as well. Well, before, a lot of them were like, you know, very predictable. You got the same monsters coming out. And then, you know, in the late 70s, we had a little killer, Michael Myers. And he was different. Oh, he was different. Slashers. And 80s, of course, was well known for the slashers. But I think the idea of being able to use these slashers and be able to get away with it opened up the Pandora's box for just some really weird and strange movies. I mean, you've got movies like Critters, alien porcupines from space killing people. Speaking of space, killer clowns from outer space. There was a whole range of just off-the-wall people, off their mind, making these movies. And like I said, some of them were hits, some of them missed, but they were always interesting to watch. And that's what I like about it. I might not have liked the movie, but I found it really, really interesting to watch them. For a few different reasons, both from just a comical standpoint, and second from a filmmaker's point of view as well, especially an independent filmmaker like myself. Seeing how they did that, how did they make these effects, how did they do this edit, how did they do this lighting. It was basically like a book for me. The other thing about 80s specific movies is not only did it open up for the future, especially if you look in the 90s where you see some of these really strange out there kind of horror movies, but I feel like the 80s cemented 80s as how to explain this really, as an accepted genre. Well, there was always horror movies. The horror genre was always looked down upon in its earlier years, kind of like the red-headed stepchild of cinema. You know, got a beating, but you know, was tolerated. The 80s, I really thought, brought horror movies into the mainstream, and it allowed bigger budgets, more well-known actors and directors come in. I mean, come on, Jaws, Spielberg. Do I have to say anything else about that? But I think the 80s horror movies really helped cement horror movies as at least a somewhat well-regarded genre to do for actors now, or directors to make, or producers to produce.